Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Hangar Bar. I am super excited to have you here with me today. We are going to be doing another Falling Down the Rabbit Hole episode. Exciting. I know it's been a couple years since we did this one. I think the last one we did, I teased when we were doing our winter break. I did a replay of the Carousel of Progress one because that's my favorite attraction. And that one was a fun one to do a deep dive into. Today's is going to be a little bit of an interesting one. We are going to dig really deep into changes at the Disney park and my Disney parks, I should say. My impetus behind doing this episode is as I think about how the Disney parks have changed over the years, there's attractions that have been removed, there's things that have been rethemed, and some of the things that I think are the most classic attractions might be on the chopping block just because of how, what's the word I'm looking for? Just because of how maybe not people eater they are. Maybe they don't get as big a crowd as they used to. Maybe they don't have a big following like some other things. We'll get into some of the other attractions, but we think about the why some of the rides changed. Why did it go from the Maelstrom to Frozen Ever After? Hint, we'll be talking about that later. Why did they move Carousel of Progress to Disney World? And because it doesn't get as much popularity and people only use it to take naps today, is that potentially on the chopping block? If it is, I've said before, I'm going to riot. We're not going to talk about that one today, but that's one of the things that I've been thinking about is when Disney makes those decisions to really change a ride or an attraction. Why do they do it? So I went in and I started digging into a few different things to kind of dig into maybe some of the more classic kind of things and really deep dive and fall down that rabbit hole to talk about why some of the things are out here because Disney parks are always evolving. And while that might mean exciting new rides that we get really excited about, think Tiana's Bayou Adventure, it also means saying goodbye to some of our fan favorite attractions like Splash Mountain. Those are some of the things that just the parks have to progress. Walt always said the park should never be finished and they should always be updating. But what does that mean to us as fans? I just think it's an interesting thing to kind of think about. Now, quick disclaimer, not every attraction is going to be mentioned. So hopefully I'm not going to skip over your favorites, but don't be afraid to come out to our social medias and say, hey, why didn't you talk about this one that's gone now? I'd love to hear you dig more into that one. I just picked some of the more classic ones that maybe were a little bit more controversial or had really solid reasoning for changes before I jumped into it. So with that, sit back, grab your beverage of choice or whatever. Let's dig in. Hey, welcome to Hanging at the Hangar Bar. I'm Scott.
And I'm Candace. We're here to chat all things Disney as child-free Disney adults. Stories, snacks, and a little magic along the way.
Grab a drink and get comfy and come hang out with us. Okay. As we jump into the rabbit hole that we're going to fall down today, I think we need to ground ourselves in an understanding of where and why do attractions change? Why do those attractions get removed? Why does Disney say, hey, we need to do this, other than just let's keep things modern, let's keep things updated, let's whatever, we need to keep bringing IP in. That's obviously one of the reasons, but there's many others. So let me give you a couple examples of why Disney may upgrade or remove an attraction. So the first thing that we want to talk about is technological advancements. Let me give you a good example of this one. So there used to be an attraction that was called Mission to Mars. Was kind of one of those slow moving kind of theater kind of shows, had really good pre-show with animatronics and was a pretty popular attraction with folks. But it was, again, slow moving. Everything in Magic Kingdom or Epcot, I should say, is kind of that slow moving edutainment kind of thing. Mission to Mars was very much that. So I think there were technological advancements that allowed them to bring a a thrill ride in and really bring better tech into Epcot and maybe draw more people into that park, because when it first opened back in the 80s, I think folks saw it as like a half day park to sort of explore showcase. There wasn't a lot to do. So I think Disney was like, how do we beef this up? How do we get more people to be excited to be here at Epcot? And that changing of Mission to Mars, while slow moving, and don't get me wrong, Mission Space does not sit where Mission to Mars sat. It just, that's the kind of general philosophy of, hey, we have a space attraction that's maybe a little slow, maybe a little too educational. Let's bring in something really cool, give people that sense of being on a rocket, still very edutainment related. I think that's why they did that one. So that's one of the reasons why Disney will change and update their rides, because of those technological advancements. Another one, let's talk about cultural and IP relevance. So, when we think about IP, Disney made a decision, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 years ago, probably about the time that Iger came in, to really hone in and focus on IP. But previous to that, they had always had some IP in the parks. You think Snow White, the castles are IP, all of those kind of things. But over time, those things lose some of their relevance, right? So you think about an old attraction like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that was replaced by the Little Mermaid ride. When they brought in the Little Mermaid ride, that was at the heart of popularity for the Little Mermaid. All the kids were singing Part of Your World. All the kids were watching that movie, and very few of them knew about the old movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Again, you have that history of bringing IP into the parks, and they want to keep things relevant. They want to keep things up to date so they can really have people continue to come back and feel that current connection to Disney, which can be hard to do because it's expensive to change some of those things. So again, there's multiple rides that kind of have that, hey, we want to bring IP relevance, or it's more culturally appropriate now that we do. I just call out 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea because that, again, that was a super popular ride. It had the submarines that people absolutely loved. But then they bring in the Little Mermaid, and that is just, I think, heck, that has one of Candace's favorite moments of any attraction in all of Disney World, when you turn your clamshell around backwards and you go down into the ocean and you feel that cool breeze that feels like you're actually moving down into the ocean. It just culturally and to IP, it just was more relevant. So they went with that. So another reason why Disney might say, "Hey, we need to close this attraction," is just they need the space and they want to expand, right? So you think about it, and this is something when I was digging into this that I actually found out that I didn't know. Disney World used to have a skyway that ran between Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. There were two stations, and it would take you up in the air over the park, so you could kind of look down upon. And I think maybe I knew that they had something like that, but I don't remember ever, like, I was never in the park when it was there, so it was kind of a shock to my system when I started thinking about that. But really, when they built New Fantasyland, they needed space. So they really said, okay, what can we get rid of? Maybe we take these tram stations or these skyway stations out and do something different with them. And there's vestiges of the old Skyway still in Disney World if you know what to look for. So in New Fantasyland, the original Skyway stop where you would get on and off the attraction is now where the tangled bathrooms sit. So it looks nothing like it. They tore down the station and put in those bathrooms. But there is a station that still exists over in Tomorrowland. You have to know what you're looking for. And honestly, next time we go to Disney, I'm definitely going to be looking for this because it's just such an interesting harkening back to the history. But the in Tomorrowland, there's a building that's between the Astro Orbiter and Space Mountain. That is And it's not the people mover queue because that's been there all along. But there's a building that still exists that used to be kind of a two-story building. They took the roof of it off and they put bathrooms in it, but that building still exists, which is really cool. I love being able to go back and say, "Hey, this is awesome. Let's look for this history. Let's look for this little piece of the past." That's if this podcast has done anything for me from that relationship, it's tied me closer to the history of the parks and the history of Disney, and I absolutely love that because now it gives me other things to really connect in the parks for that maybe people that are local to Disney have known all along, but now I get to go look for it. And that's just I love that. It's so cool. So the final reason why I'm going to call out that Disney may say, "Hey, let's get rid of an attraction." Maintenance and cost issues. So a couple things in Disneyland. They used to also have a skyway in Disneyland, but the structural supports on it were starting to fail. So it was less safe. So they said, "Okay, we got to close it. We got to remove it. Too expensive to rebuild." So the other thing that was hugely popular in Disneyland is they also had their own version of a people mover. And that got closed down as well because for a couple of different reasons. First, the Imagineers just didn't think it was fun enough anymore. It was not cutting edge enough. It was dated. It definitely didn't feel like Tomorrowland. So the Imagineers were like, "Okay, is this really appropriate for this part of the park?" And I think that's just an interesting question that Imagineers need to be asking themselves all the time. The second reason why the People Mover in Disneyland closed is it came at a time when Disney needed to find money. And there were attractions that cost a lot of money to run that didn't necessarily provide the value to Disney. So at the time, Michael Eisner said, "You know what? That People Mover just it's costing us too much money. It's too expensive, and the Imagineers already think it's dated and it's just a place for people to rest their feet. Why would we keep it? So let's close that down. Let's not spend the money on it for the upkeep, for the ride vehicles, for all of that, and just let's get rid of it." And again, that's another one of those things that when you go to Disneyland, you can still see the People Mover piers and the track for it. So if at some point if they decided they wanted to bring it back, they totally could. But those are just a few of the reasons why why Disney might get rid of an attraction. So let's jump into a few different attractions that we think, well, I don't have a frog in my pocket. I'm going to talk about a few different attractions that really they they got taken away from us, sometimes too soon, sometimes not soon enough, and sometimes they were precursors to things. So we're gonna go through a few attractions, and honestly, like I think there's only one or two of these that I know I ever was on the original. So it's gonna be interesting. And when I was digging into this one, it was it, again, I'm struggling with my words today, but it was such an interesting history lesson for me on some of these things that as we went through, I'm like, "Oh, that would have been a cool attraction." I can see why people almost rioted when that went away. So we're going to jump in to just a few of those. We're going to start in Disneyland, and then the rest of them are going to be in Disney World. And we're going to touch every park at Disney World except for Animal Kingdom. But we'll get into Animal Kingdom when we start talking about the future a little bit. But let's start in Disneyland. There was an attraction from 1961 to 1966. This attraction lasted a total of 5 years. It was called Disneyland's Flying Saucers. It was in Tomorrowland, and it featured floating saucer-like vehicles. So it was basically, if you think about an air hockey table and how the puck kind of floats over the table, and you can move it around, makes it easier to move around. So it used air pressure to lift the ride vehicles up off the ground so they could move around and do different things. And then you could you could have it move in different directions. It might be kind of random. The guest would be able to do certain things, like a guest could lean their body to move the saucers, and that was kind of the intention of it. It was almost like a bumper cars kind of thing where you would lean and move, and it would move the vehicles around. But it didn't always work. The it such new technology, the air underneath, that had mixed success with people moving that around on their own. So let's talk a little bit about why it was removed. The flying saucers were notoriously unreliable. They wouldn't move properly. The air jets wouldn't work. The ride vehicles wouldn't lift. And if you get into one of those ride vehicles that all of a sudden isn't lifting, your time on that attraction is not going to be fun. So it just became a nightmare to really keep it up and running. And those air compressors that they used to lift them to blow the air up were super duper expensive. And if you think about like the 1960s, newish technology, finding parts for something that you've invented or done is really going to be hard to do. And because it was so prone to failure, it was an expensive fix every single time. Loading and unloading for these things was also very slow because you'd have to let the ride vehicles get down to ground. They'd have to lift up. The lines were it was just hard to get people on and off of this attraction, which ended up causing long waits. And while Disney is very good at queues, it's kind of tough to do an outdoor queue where you see, okay, why is it taking 5 minutes to load this ride vehicle? I'm just standing here watching the ride vehicles be empty. It's just lots of reasons why that one just didn't quite work, I think, the way Disney wanted it to, which again is why it only lasted 5 years. Now, here's some things that are rather interesting. If you think about it, this was actually a precursor to another ride, attraction, I should say. In 2012, there was in Cars Land in Disney's California Adventure, there was an attraction called Luigi's Flying Tires that used the exact same technology. They attempted to revive the idea, and basically the tires would pick up and float. You'd move around, you could move your body, and that would be what moved the ride vehicles along, all of that kind of thing. And they gave that a try. What's funny though is like, hey, what goes around comes around. That attraction, Luigi's Flying Tires, failed for the exact same reason. Slow load times, unreliable tech, unreliable parts, all of those kind of things. So Luigi's Flying Tires was actually um, discontinued as well and replaced by Luigi's Rockin' Roadsters in 2016. So it only lasted 4 years the second time they tried it. And when they replaced it with Luigi's Rollickin' Roadsters, I can't remember. Did I say that right the first time I said it? But it's Luigi's Rollickin' Roadsters in California Adventure today, which just completely abandoned that air-based movement and just set it up to be more of an attraction that can be more reliable and keep people moving and not be down and not cost as much to repair. So that's what we're going to talk about in Disneyland. Again, we talked about a couple things in the first part when we talked about why they close rides from Disneyland, but that's the main ride that I wanted to kind of talk about, because that flying saucers was a cool concept. It's really kind of an amazing thing to think about, that you as a person get to be out on a big air hockey table and moving around. So that's one that's interesting. So here is one. We're going to move on to one that's probably, there's folks that are still salty about this one. And again, I was never able to see this attraction in Disney World, but we're going to move into Magic Kingdom and we're going to talk about Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. There was an exact replica. Well, I don't think it was an exact replica. There was a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in Disney World as well as Disneyland. It still sits in Disneyland, so it's not gone forever. It's just gone forever from Disney World. So the ride experience, let me just set the stage here. Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is based on the Wind in the Willows segment of The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. I think we talked about this with Lacey and Lariah last season, about that being such a classic Disney animated movie show. I don't know that I'd consider it a movie, but I also don't consider it a short or something. Yeah. Yeah, I think you get what I'm saying, but it's if you haven't seen The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, go out and watch it. It's worth the watch. But the Wind on the Willows segment is about Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and that's where the ride is attached. Completely chaotic, dark ride that Disney is famous for, featuring Toad's reckless driving escapades. So you would load yourself into a car. There'd be somebody sitting behind a steering wheel, somebody in a passenger, and then I think there were probably two people in the back seat as well. And you just kind of go through, and I always find this funny because Mr. Toad was a drunk driver. He like you were in a car driven by a drunk toad. It's hilarious to me that that's kind of the way that worked out. And it really is one of those things that is, you think about Disney, you don't think about them having an attraction that is a drunk frog driving around. But but anyway, that was kind of a tangent. So what this ride is most known for is the ending. So you go through, you're basically this drunk driver throughout this entire attraction, just this chaotic kind of movement in and around the attraction. And at the end, you crashed into a train and you ended up in hell. I'm going to say that again. You crashed into a train and you ended up in hell. You died on this attraction. Every single time you went on it, you died on this attraction. Crazy, right? Weird. Okay, so why did Mr. Toad's Wild Ride get removed? Because it is a popular attraction in Disneyland. It was an extremely popular attraction in Disney World as well. It was replaced by Winnie the Pooh's ride, and such a cute ride. We'll talk about Winnie the Pooh at some other point. That attraction is one of my favorites, and like, you talk about becoming a kid at Disney, that Winnie the Pooh attraction is one that just turns me into a 4-year-old every time, playing with the honey wall in the queue, all of that kind of stuff. I just absolutely love it. Winnie the Pooh was deemed a more recognizable IP for modern audiences when it was put in. The Wind in the Willows and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad were dated, older, not showing up on TV, didn't have a lot of books written like the Winnie the Pooh series does. So Disney just said, you know what, let's put something that's a little bit more recognizable for modern audiences in this. And not to mention, let's make this a little bit more kid-friendly in Magic Kingdom. They wanted to increase that appeal for younger kids that were coming to the parks and give them another attraction, because the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride could be pretty scary if for the little ones. So Winnie the Pooh is not scary except for maybe the Heffalump scene. But again, that's just bright colors. It gets a little darker, but it's not as scary as Ichabod and Mr. Crane's. Wow, I'm struggling with English. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. The other thing that they needed to think about was the space where that attraction sits is super small, making expansion difficult. They couldn't turn it into something much bigger. They couldn't put a roller coaster in, so they really just rethemed it, put the honey pots in, changed the theming around to be the Winnie the Pooh. And again, as I mentioned, this attraction is super, super, super popular. Even back in the 90s when this was being removed, there were petitions and protests creating Save Toad campaigns around Disney. So like all that we hear on social media when people are bitching about Splash Mountain going away, or their beloved attraction changing for whatever. Like, I've always kind of thought that was maybe just because of the advent of how easy it is for people to be able to share their opinions online. People can easily start a podcast just because they don't like the way the Maelstrom changed to Frozen Ever After. Again, we'll get to more than that in a minute. But we really, there's always been fan outrage when something changes. So even dating back to the 90s, late 90s, so close to 30 years ago, there were these Save Toad campaigns that went on. So much so that Disney really placed a tribute to the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride attraction, there's a picture in the Winnie the Pooh attraction of Mr. Toad handing over the deed of the location to Owl from Winnie the Pooh, which is just so cute. It's up front and center. You can see it. It's not even like it's really all that hidden. It's one of those things that really I encourage you to look at when you're there, because it's, again, a fun nod to history. Again, let's talk a little bit about the legacy of what we're talking about here. So Disneyland's version still exists, like I said, keeping it alive in some form. So if you absolutely have to get on Mr. Toad's, go out to Anaheim and get on the attraction. It's there for you. The other thing to keep in mind is Mr. Toad references continue to pop up around the Disney parks. The main one that I will call out is in Haunted Mansion at Magic Kingdom. When you leave the attraction, you walk by a pet cemetery that has a reference to Mr. Toad, which I think is just fantastic and a great way to kind of honor what was happening there. Okay, so let's move on to the next attraction that is a harkening back to a bygone era that people kind of loved. And if you watch online influencers and videos and that kind of thing, you'll see a lot of people that harken back to this attraction, which I think is kind of awesome. And I wish I had been able to see it. So Horizons was in Epcot from 1983 to 1999. The ride's theme was basically a spiritual sequel to Carousel of Progress. So it presented a vision of the future, touching on space colonization, underwater cities, and desert farming. So you think Horizons was such a way for, like, I think about all that might mean. It means like this mission to Mars. It means like, you think about Spaceship Earth, where you get to kind of pick where you want to go at the end when you're going backwards down the hill. You get to pick kind of, do you want to live underwater? Do you want to live in the sky? How do you want to ride? All of those kind of things. And it talks about desert farming, all of those kind of things. And really, it is such a fun way to think about it. A good edutainment series, story, attraction that Epcot became famous for. The cool thing about Horizons, though, was guests got to choose their own ending, which in 1983, for an attraction like that, was a completely groundbreaking concept. Just amazing, like another way that Disney is kind of ahead of the curve. So let's talk a little bit about why this one was removed. So it was getting old, like 1983 to 1999. You're talking 16 years there. The 90s, the late 90s and the early 80s, if you think about that, had completely different feels to them. So the ride was starting to age, maybe not aging all that well, and was really seen as outdated. So it was losing some of its popularity. There's also some rumors that the roof of the Horizons building was starting to be structurally compromised. Disney obviously never officially confirmed that, but it was one of the things that they were talking about, that, oh, maybe it's just not going to be safe. It's going to be too expensive to fix that. All of those kind of things. The other reason why this one was removed is, remember, we've talked a little bit in this podcast how Disney has had sponsors for things in the past. This was no different. General Motors was the sponsor for Horizons, and they pulled their funding. So when you pull funding from an attraction that's outdated, that is not maybe as popular as it once was, people are not going to it as much, you need to make it a full day park instead of a half day park, all of a sudden the decision to close it really becomes pretty easy. Again, I mentioned this one was really a cult classic for Disney fans. It really became one of those things that people grabbed onto. The technology was cool. People that grew up in the early 80s hit kind of their 12 to 20 years in the early 80s. Really, they clung to it. It's what they hung on to. And really, when that closed, there were a lot of people that were really upset about that one too. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. It's not trivia time with Candace because she's not part of this episode today. But how many of you out there have heard the quote, if we dream it, if we can dream it, we can do it? Or if you can dream it, you can do it. And it's always signed with a byline, Walt Disney. It was never a phrase uttered by Walt. That phrase, if we can dream it, we can do it, came from the Horizons attraction. Now, that may be worth another rabbit hole because I don't have it with me, but I remember reading a story about how that quote actually came to be and who actually said it. And it's such a interesting, it's probably not a full episode kind of falling down the rabbit hole episode idea, but basically that attraction or that quote that's now attributed to Walt was created in some back room by a copywriter somewhere, which is just intriguing to me how you can have just words that are spoken become that iconic and just have that lasting impact on people. That was a diatribe. Sorry. Just I think it's interesting that quote that's attributed to Walt came from this attraction. So, a couple other things for this attraction. You have the Horizons building was where Mission Space sits now, and we've talked about that. That offers a much more intense, thrill-based version of what the future is going to look like, and I think we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. Maybe not, but if we have time, we'll get into that. And then also, if you think about Horizons, there's tributes. If you go to Space 220, there are tributes to Horizons in that restaurant. There's also lots of different places around Epcot and the attractions that kind of make a call out to Horizons, which I think is really interesting. Staying in Epcot in 1988. In the Norway Pavilion, a small little attraction called the Maelstrom opened. And one of my co-hosts for this podcast, Candace, loves the Maelstrom. It was one of her first things that she did in Epcot, the trolls, all of that kind of thing. I don't think I ever went on the Maelstrom, but I remember the trolls in the Norway Pavilion, that kind of thing. But I don't think I was ever on the attraction. But Candace absolutely adored it. It closed in 2014 in favor of Frozen Ever After. I can hear Candace booing as she's listening to this right now. I'm sure you all can too. But let's talk a little bit about what the Maelstrom was. It was a Viking-themed boat ride through Norway's history, mythology, and, well, random oil rigs. They were there in the attraction. It's kind of funny that like it was really, it taught you about Norway and all that kind of came with Norway. Because that's what World Showcase is all about. It's about sharing the cultures. It's about teaching you more about that. It gives people a chance that maybe will never get the opportunity to visit Norway, a chance to learn about that culture and sort of expand what they know and how they know and really connect with a different group of people in an interesting way. That's what that attraction was originally meant to do, was connect you more to Norway. It included a short backwards drop and a near plunge over a waterfall. And it's kind of interesting. Like if you were on that attraction, you could sort of see if you're sitting out in the World Showcase looking back towards the attraction, there was a hole and you could actually see, and the boat would actually feel like it was going to be falling out of that little window that was in the attraction wall. And people on the outside could see the boats coming back before it would go back down, which is really interesting and a really cool thing to do. And I believe they covered up that hole when they put Frozen Ever After in. Again, I've not been on Frozen Ever After. Maybe on the next trip I'll get Candace to let me go on it, or she'll go on it with me because I don't want to wait in a 9-hour line by myself. But we'll figure that out later. And then the attraction ended with a film about modern Norway, which most guests just kind of walked right on by. It was one of the, why do I want to take time to learn about that when they should take the time to learn about that? So let's talk a little bit about why it was removed. Frozen had become a massive hit. And Disney saw an opportunity to bring more IP into the park. They saw a way to connect more people to World Showcase. They saw a way to get more people back into World Showcase, going through attractions. Maybe that helps thin out the crowd in World Showcase a little bit because maybe you have 2,000 people standing in line to get on this attraction, making up that number. I don't know how many people go through that ride in an hour, but it does. It eats people. You have the queue that you're standing in line, and all of that kind of thing. So Disney saw the opportunity to say, "Hey, let's do something different because we have this really popular Norway adjacent IP." The Norway pavilion wasn't drawing crowds like it used to. The Maelstrom wasn't as popular of an attraction. People weren't going to Norway just for that. They were the bakery there, maybe what there's better food around Epcot. So it was becoming kind of a walk by kind of country in World Showcase. So why not do something to bring more people into that pavilion? Okay. So let's talk about why this one, I believe it was a bad move on Disney's part. Now, I get 100% why they do it. It's Norway adjacent. It took something that never had a wait to something that now has, on average, a 60 to 75-minute wait and is just far more popular. I get it, but it doesn't fit in World Showcase. It doesn't fit in Norway. Arendelle is a fictional place. Norway adjacent. Yes, we can talk about that. But really, as I mentioned, World Showcase is about celebrating culture. It's about celebrating real places, and Frozen is neither one of those things. It's just yeah, I could go on for probably hours talking about why I think Frozen really was not the right thing to put there. Up if you want to update and do something different and maybe throw in some Frozen elements to the Maelstrom because it is so tied to the culture, sure. Maybe find a way to do that, change the music out a little bit, whatever. But just taking all of that away just seems like the wrong thing to do. The other thing is it really it started the whole pandering to IP, new IP in World Showcase instead of celebrating all of those real cultures. Like our bar in our basement, we have different signs from around World Showcase because we want to celebrate those cultures. You know the one we don't have? Norway because it has Frozen on it. I don't want that. Like that's not celebrating that culture. It's celebrating a fictional place. So again, you can tell I'm pretty passionate about this, and I'm only half as passionate about it as Candace is. So I will say there are still some things that remain within the attraction. The track is exactly the same. The layout is the same. The story changed 100%, but there are still Viking references within. There's the trolls I think might still be there, or they're still in Norway somewhere. There's still carvings in the queue line that are Viking related. So my guess is they left those things because they were too expensive to change, because they really went all in on kind of that Frozen view. And again, yeah, I'm going to move on just because I could talk about that for days, weeks, and hours, I am sure. Okay, so the next attraction we're going to talk about is the Great Movie Ride in Hollywood Studios. That opened up in 1989 and closed in 2017. And then it kind of sat empty for a little bit and then became Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway Building. So the premise of the Great Movie Ride, again, this harkens back to when Hollywood Studios was an actual functioning studio. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute as well. But it really brought you into the movies and made you feel like you were on you were in the movies. And I know I've said on this podcast before that it feels like that's what they're trying to do with Hollywood studios as a whole, is just like make the whole place feel like you've been dropped into the movies. And the Great Movie Ride did that, but it showed all of those old classic Hollywood movies, and you got to feel like you were a part of them. And it was just an interesting thing. It was a super slow moving dark ride through classic Hollywood films, and you had a live cast member that was with your ride vehicle, and they narrated throughout and made you a part of the story, which was really interesting. Some of the scenes that were included in the Great Movie Ride were Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz, Alien, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. There were interactive elements where the ride vehicle could be taken over by a gangster or a Western bandit. Just really cool. And when this one went away, it almost felt like they were taking live entertainment away at the same time. Not just a beloved attraction, but you had cast members that were actual actors in this, that were playing gangsters or the Western bandits, and you had your person that was riding along with your ride vehicle narrating everything for you. All of those things just kind of played into what was a fantastic attraction. Now, why was this one removed? This is going to make some sense. Like, I never really dug into why this one was closed. I was just mad that it closed, because I know I said I don't think I had been on any of these attractions, but I do believe I was on the Great Movie Ride. I do think I was on that attraction once or twice, because yeah, I'll just leave that there. But why did this one get removed? Because it was a very popular attraction. So the first and probably most important reason is Disney lost the rights to many of the classic films in the ride. So as they signed a contract back in 1989, being able to use Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz, Alien, some of those things that they didn't own the IP for, and that contract kind of came up, and they couldn't negotiate for the rights again, or didn't want to negotiate for the rights. They were going to be too expensive, that kind of thing. So they just decided, you know what, probably not worth trying to find new movies, retheme it. All of those kind of things probably would have just been a little bit too much. So the technology was aging. The projections had also become a little outdated. The technology behind the projections had gotten so much better. You think about, again, 1990 to 2017, how much technology changed, and kind of what that might have looked like. It really did feel like it was an old attraction. So the other reason why is, I think Disney was looking for a way to give Mickey and Minnie their own ride. They never had one before, so Runaway Railway just became a fitting replacement, and it takes the space of that theater. It has I don't want to give too many spoilers in case you haven't been on the attraction, but it takes you into the cartoons. It's a fun attraction, and I think a great replacement. And a lot of the queue line is still theater related, Great Movie Ride related. So they left a lot of that in place. Again, did they do that because it would have been too expensive to retheme, or did they do that because they wanted to harken back to Great Movie Ride and have you feel like you're in that theater and you're being brought into the actual movie? So it really is. I think it was a good replacement. I loved the Great Movie Ride, but I also absolutely love Runaway Railway. I think it was a good change and a good update. But lots of fans disagree with me. There are some, my wife Candace included, that would probably argue that Hollywood Studios kind of lost the plot when they closed it. Hollywood Studios is about movies. It's about creating movies. That's what people knew it by back when it was the Disney Studios and it was a live, actual working lot. All of those kind of things existed, and when you close the Great Movie Ride, you feel like you're moving away from what Hollywood Studios or Disney Studios was all about. People super nostalgic about that ride. It didn't have strong Disney IP connections, but it had so many recognizable movies. You get to be in The Wizard of Oz. How many of us grew up with The Wizard of Oz and watching it on TV every year because it came on TV every year as we were growing up? All of those kind of things were there, and that nostalgia just really had people hang on tight. So here's as we think about the legacy of that ride, I think let's talk a little bit about Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway again, because it does pay some tributes with hidden references. I'm not going to spoil those for you, but I'm going to, next time I ride that attraction, I'm going to go out and look for the Great Movie Ride references, and see if I can kind of find those. Because again, it gives you something else to look for, something else to do in the detail outside of just the theater feeling the same. Like the outside theater feels the same in the queue line feels like the Great Movie Ride. Let's look for some of those hidden references that might be in the actual attraction itself. And then ultimately, even though Disney was able to partner with Turner Classic Movies, it really was not enough to save that attraction, probably because of the aging, the projections becoming a little bit older, and all of those kind of things. Okay, for the last one, super popular kind of thing that was again in Hollywood Studios / Disney Studios, opened again in 1989 and closed in 2014, so 3 years before the Great Movie Ride. And again, I think this is another one that I went on, but it obviously didn't create such a momentous moment that I absolutely remember it minute by minute. Um, but I think I remember being on the backlot tour, but I may have also be confusing it with the Universal Studios in California that I went to when I was 9. So I'm not 100% sure I was on this one, but it sounds really familiar. So the original concept of the backlot tour at Hollywood Studios was it was a 2-hour tour that simulated a working studio backlot. It featured Catastrophe Canyon, real production sets that were in use. I think you drove by the Golden Girls house at one point. I think you drove by a replica of the Brady Bunch. I could be wrong about that, but it felt like you were on a tour of a real backlot studio. As you went on this attraction, you drove by and you could see into the costume and prop warehouses where they were actually building sets and building costumes and props for actual movies that were being made. So there were props that were on display there from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids back in the day. And that was just a really cool thing. So let's talk a little bit about why the backlot tour was closed. Disney MGM Studios was never a fully, truly working studio. It was more of a theme park gimmick. I think they had intention of trying to make it a studio, but it's hard to have a working studio when you also have 50,000 guests traipsing through and a tram full of people going through the middle of your set every day. It's just it never quite worked out. It was more of a marketing / theme park gimmick to show you how it all worked. As Hollywood Studios shifted focus, there were 2 parks that have now become very beloved that needed space. You had Galaxy's Edge that they had announced and were building, and Toy Story Land. Both needed space to be created and expand and all of those kind of things. So that backlot tour took a lot of room. So they said, okay, number one, not a lot of people are coming through here. It's the interest in it, the interest in the behind the scenes tour type content was declining. It was becoming less popular. We want to bring in this IP from Toy Story. We want to bring in this IP from Star Wars. Let's take this down and use this space for other things. And I think again, the backlot tour was super popular. I think this is one of those things that ended up being a good decision. Your park is more interactive. You still feel like I don't know that Disney has ever really come out and said this, but they are focused really on trying to make the entire park feel like you are in the movies. You go into Toy Story Land, you're shrunk down to the size of a toy. You go into Galaxy's Edge and you feel like you're on a different planet. like there's all of those different things that it feels like that's what they're trying to do with Hollywood studios over time. So it's interesting. We'll see how that continues to go, because it's been a long transition if that's really what they're trying to do. It just and again, I don't think they've ever announced that, but it just feels like that's what they're trying to do. So let's talk a little bit about the backlot tour and kind of what it led to. So pieces of the backlot tour, like Catastrophe Canyon, inspired parts of Cars Land at California Adventure. So if you like go, I think it's their version of Test Track, which is a Cars themed racer, was really a that looks like Catastrophe Canyon, and so they use that imagery, they use kind of that look and that backlot feel to do some of that, and then props from the old tour were definitely repurposed into other areas such as Star Wars, Galaxy's Edge, that kind of thing. So that was just a few of the attractions that have moved on, and why they were closed. Hopefully you found that as interesting as I did. I really thought that as I started digging in, that we there was a lot of interesting stuff there that I didn't know, and it really gave me an opportunity to go in and look. But before we close out this episode, I just want to talk about a couple other things. What's the future of lost attractions? There's a few things that have been announced that I think, again, are pretty popular, that are now considered lost attractions. You think about Tiana's Bayou Adventure replacing Splash Mountain. That was a big one. That was a cultural thing. That was a bringing newer IP into the park, that kind of thing. But there's other things that could be on the chopping block. So let's think a little bit about some of the things that might be. Let's talk about Animal Kingdom for a minute. Dinoland USA is closing. Dinosaur is closing. They've announced that that's being rethemed over to an Indiana Jones attraction. They're bringing in Zootopia into what was Dinoland. So think about all of the things that are closing down there in the name of bringing in all of that IP that really is there to be there for the taking. They're bringing in Encanto into that area as well. So are they bringing Zootopia is going into the Bug's Life in the Tree of Life. So I don't think Zootopia is going to be a part of like the Encanto and where they're putting Indiana Jones in. I don't think. I could be wrong about that. I apologize if I am. But that's huge changes coming to Animal Kingdom, and that park's not all that old. It's there. Yeah, lots to do there. Let's talk about one also that I think probably does need to have something done with it. The Tomorrowland Speedway. Those old gas-powered go-kart cars that when you walk by there, you almost get sick from the fumes, is just ridiculous. But I wonder what would be a good replacement for that. Like, you think about Tomorrowland Speedway. I don't think they could do like an electric vehicle kind of thing, because the batteries would get too hot in the Florida sun, all of those kind of things. But could they do like a trolley car kind of view that runs on electric wires that go around? Or could they electric make the instead of having gas powered engines, use magnetic pro- propulsion on the track that's underneath it to kind of get it to move around? I think there's things that they can do with that, or heck, they might even just completely change it over and do something different with it. The other thing I want to just spend a couple of seconds talking about is, are there some things that maybe need to be revamped? Are there some things that maybe need to close? Now, Small World is never going to close, but do they need to rethink it? Do they need to redo it? Something interesting to think about. Come out to our social media and definitely let us know what you think might need to be done to Small World to make it more relevant to today and make it more poignant for today. I think that's an interesting one. What about potential comeback? Figment's attraction was the Dream Finder, used to be a huge part of that, and people love the Dream Finder and still call for that to be made a part of the attraction. As Figment gets more popular, back within Epcot, is there a chance that we bring that back? Test Track is closing, and there's rumors that Horizons is going to be a part of the Test Track revamp. So lots of really cool things are potentially happening there. And I think we also think about things around Magic Kingdom. They are building Villains Land, which means they're having to get rid of the Liberty Bell, and they're getting rid of Tom Sawyer's Island to make room for Cars Land in Magic Kingdom. That's the thing. Let me just, as I finish this segment on what's could potentially be happening, let me just say this. Disney needs to continue to change. They need to continue to update, because if they don't, in 20 years you're going to be sitting back, looking back saying everything looks dated and out of place. This isn't fun anymore. I don't want to go here anymore. But if they continue to make changes and they continue to update the right things at the right time, and we can always debate whether or not it was the right time, but as long as they continue to update and prioritize that, I think we'll end up being a pretty good place. So I think that's a great place for us to kind of stop and wrap up. I think as I think back through all of the things we've talked about, I want to think about, what attraction do I miss most? I For me, like I said, I like the fact that the parks change. I've always said that if they touch Carousel of Progress, I'm going to riot, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be updated. We got to figure out a way to make that attraction relevant as we move forward over the next 20 to 100 years. Or, like we've talked about before, can you retheme Tomorrowland to be Walt's Tomorrowland so it can feel more historic based on what Walt's vision of tomorrow looked like? That would be a way to sort of save that attraction from having to be updated in that last scene, because eventually you may have to take Carousel of Progress and say, you know what, instead of starting in the turn of the century, maybe we need to start it in the 1950s and talk about how technology has changed, and make those scenes just move every 25 years or so, have those scenes all move forward 25 years and have the attraction start in a different place. And that way you kind of end up with an attraction that's always evolving to what the vision of tomorrow is supposed to be. But again, I could go on for days about that. I think if I were to say an attraction that I kind of miss, heck, like, I don't know why I'm not thinking of anything that's gone that I really miss right now. I think so. I'm just going to leave the question to you all. Why don't you come out to our social media? Tell us what you miss the most. What's the attraction that you wish wasn't gone? What's something that you wish that Disney hadn't changed? So let's share our favorite lost attractions on social media. Let's commiserate, let's think about the future, all of those kind of things as we move forward. So come out to Facebook, Instagram, let us know kind of what your thoughts are, interact with us there. We want to hear from you. We want you to be a part of the show. And yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it. And as we end every episode, folks, remember, there is a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, and we'll see you real soon.